a good story has a few good things, right? Delivery is so key. How do you deliver the story? Do you show emotion? Do you show passion? Do you use your hands? Do you use your eyes, right? A story is not just about words. So always think about that as how do we deliver the story. Presentations, even what I'm presenting to you today, you're probably going to remember my daughter's story more inclined than you are to actually remember the facts that I'm presenting on this slide, right? The things that stay in are the things that captivate you, right? That are memorable moments. And, this is a stat that you probably already have heard anyway, but 92% of anything we buy day in and day out is actually based off emotion and story. We don't buy it only based off the facts. We buy it based off because our friend bought it or because it sparked some emotion that we didn't know about, right? So there is some science behind this that stories do matter. Highlight what's missing in the market. What are we struggling, right? What is that issue? And don't be scared to bring it up because that's actually going to get people engaged.
Hello, Leaguers, and welcome to today's Practical Wednesday session. Now, let's be honest for a second. How good are your storytelling skills? I know that you've got a passion, you've got the knowledge, you've got the vision. But when it comes to catching other people's attention, we can talk about customers, team members, stakeholders maybe. How good are you in making them listen to what you've got to say? How good are you in making them move? So, by the way, I'm Maria Cassis, founder and general manager of Product League, and we help you to become the best product manager you can be. Product League is an international mentoring program for product managers by product managers. So today, on this Practical Wednesday session, we are going to listen to VivekBedi. So tomorrow, everyone will listen to you. With that in mind, this is the best time to call into the stage VivekBedi. It's so great having you here with us today. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So Vivek is the author of the book You, the Product, and former VP product of companies including LearnVest and Goldman Sachs. He's an experienced leader with a unique combination of deep product management expertise, disruptive executive leadership, and a portfolio of motivational keynotes that have inspired thousands of individuals around the world. And if you somehow missed Vivek's first talk on our channel, please make sure to watch it. It's all about soft skills, hard goals, and how to bring the passion that you have to product management into your action in a way that will make you and everyone around you to feel amazing. How are you today, Vivek?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be on. Thank you for having me on.
It's great. Okay, I think this is the right time to have you on the stage. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience that Vivek is here for you to answer your questions. So please use the chat. We want to hear from you. Listen, engage, ask questions. You just use the chat to share your thoughts and questions with us and Vivek. We go over it at the end of the session. We'll have a Q&A session. So the first with the questions in, the first one to get these questions answered, just saying. Looking forward to seeing what the guys have in mind and what questions they will bring to the chat. And this is it. Vivek, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you for joining and thank you for having me. So my talk's really going to be around the art of storytelling. As the team mentioned before, I was on talking about the EQ skills, and storytelling for me is just so important when it comes to success as a product manager. So I'll share some insight. I'll share some challenges that I had, some issues and stumbling blocks and stories that I had, and hopefully you can get out of this is, to move on to the next day and think about how storytelling fits into your product management career. So what's my story, right? Speaking of stories, my quick story I'll tell you all is I'm from New York, New Jersey. I live in the New Jersey area with my wife. We have 2 young kids, an 8 and 11-year-olds. And it's been interesting being home right now in quarantine and, figuring out how to be a teacher and a leader at the same time. So it's been a lot of challenges on that front. My career, I started at Goldman Sachs from the tech roots, spent some time disrupting and innovating the technology there, said, I don't want to work at big companies, moved over to startups. Then my startup got acquired by Goldman Sachs, had my own startup around the way, ended up at Northwestern Mutual. So really bounced around between big companies and startups and have really seen how product has evolved from both ends of the spectrum, from the startup world as well as the big company, Fortune 100 company side as well. So quick exercise, and let's see if we can use the live chat for this. Hopefully, if not, we'll figure it out. I want to just share a quick story, right? This is a quick story. This is an exercise that I do with a lot of workshops that I have around this topic. And the story is very simple. Let's imagine that one of our friends, her name is Becky, right? Becky needs a new smartphone. She did some research online and the new iPhone was rated well. Becky went to her local Apple store and bought a new iPhone. Okay, so that is a story. That is a very good story. That is telling us the point of what happened. Becky wanted somebody as an actor. She did some homework and she went out and bought it, right? But there's so many ways we can probably improve that story. And I'm going to come back to this exercise. But if in the comments, I don't know if you can do this, any quick thoughts on how you would improve this story? What are some components or ideas that you think this story is missing? So as I'm speaking through the next few slides, I'll quickly look over, but this is a valid story. It has a start and an ending, but how can we make this better, right? And this is what we're faced with day in and day out as we're thinking through our adventures in product management. A good story, guys, a good story has a few good things, right? Delivery. Delivery is so key. How do you deliver the story? Do you show emotion? Do you show passion? Do you use your hands? Do you use your eyes, right? A story is not just about words. So always think about that as how do we deliver the story? The best stories are the simplest stories, right? In the end of the day, the stories need to be simple, right? I was reading a good book about a former Amazon exec, and he was the CTO of Amazon, and he was on a podcast, and he was like, yeah, I can talk about Amazon and the technology and how it sits on the TCP/IP stack and how it sits on cloud services, or I can just call it the online store, right? So it's really about how do you relate to your audience and make it simple. We're going to talk a lot about the third bullet because it's very important in a great story: conflict. Good stories, if you think back to your days of kindergarten and fairy tales, good stories always have a problem. They have a conflict. They have a struggle. They have something that really makes the story exciting, right? And draws people in. Emotion, emotion, emotion. You're going to hear this all from me all the time. All good stories have emotion, and there's a good and a bad, right? There's a hero and a villain. I'll share a quick story, no pun intended, with you guys right now. One of the best storytellers I've met in my life is actually my 8-year-old daughter. Okay. She probably gets it from her mom, not from me, but she is so good at telling stories because she actually hits all of these bullets. As I was thinking of putting this slide together, I thought of her. She's 8, and I'll share a quick story what she was talking about. She's in 2nd grade, and she was talking about a boy in her class who hadn't cut his nails. And she was sharing the story with us and the emotion that she had. She's like, this boy, his nails were so long. And I really told him, like, you need to cut your nails, right? And that passion she got into it, the way she delivered it, her facial expressions. And it's just a story that I still remember till this day. And I think that through. And that's how you really kind of tell that great story. And it's funny that my daughter is someone in my family who I always think back to. My wife just made me watch this recently, and I was like, I'm not going to watch this. And then she's like, just watch it. I said, I'm not going to watch it. 5 minutes in, I said, I love this. I watched Becoming on Netflix from Michelle Obama. And, a quote, it's not one of those famous Michelle Obama quotes, but it's a quote that actually stuck with me that I heard there. People focus too much on stats and not stories, right? This is why stories matter. And, President Obama is actually one of the best storytellers I've seen in the political scene, right? He was great at delivering the message and getting people behind them. But there is some science behind this too. They say, and this is some studies that I can send to you guys afterwards, 22 more memorable moments are created via stories than facts, right? People are going to remember the story more than they'll remember the fact. In fact, presentations, even what I'm presenting to you today, you're probably going to remember my daughter's story more inclined than you are to actually remember the facts that I'm presenting on this slide, right? This is the way we're wired as humans. Like, that's how our brain operates, whether you're in product or not. And you probably don't know it every day, but your brain is wired to, there's so much coming in and most is going out. The things that stay in are the things that captivate you, right? That are memorable moments. And, this is a stat that you probably already have heard anyway, but 92% of anything we buy day in and day out is actually based off emotion and story. We don't buy it only based off the facts. We buy it based off because our friend bought it or because it sparked some emotion that we didn't know about, right? So there is some science behind this, that stories do matter. And I would recommend watching Becoming by Michelle Obama if you haven't already. It's so great. And it just resonates on how important stories are. Now, why do we care? Why should we as product managers care? You probably don't realize this, but you're doing stories and conducting stories in one form or another every single moment of your day. Roadmaps, you're telling stories to senior leaders, executives, stakeholders. You're trying to take things in a quarterly sequence view and you're trying to put it together and make a story out of it, right? Your stand-ups with your tech team, they're stories. You're not sitting there writing code with them. You're telling them some user requirements or user stories that eventually turn into lines of code. Product demos, another example of stories. Requirement gathering, strategy. Everything we do as product manager is actually centered around stories. So I would argue storytelling is actually the most important skill for product managers. What separates the good PM from the great and awesome PM, in my mind, is taking that storytelling skill and taking it to the next level. I shared this in my last talk, but I'll share it with you as well. The first question I ask anyone who comes in to interview for my team is, what's your story, right? Within the first 5 minutes, and just from that question, I already know if you're on the potential to being hired or not. Because if you can't tell a great story about yourself and your career, like I did in the beginning of this talk, then how are you going to be able to tell the stories in and day out as the product skill, right? So anyone can learn how to run a sprint or do a demo or write requirements, but can you actually bring it to life and make a story out of it? So this is why this is so critical for us. And this is why it's really important as product managers, we need to focus on it. And this is why I wrote my book. This is the book. Thank you for mentioning in the beginning. It's on Amazon, available today. It's called You, the Product. 2 chapters are dedicated to storytelling alone. I will share a few of the tips in today's talk, but there's tons more. But, other topics around it are, navigating politics, negotiating, right? Product management is still a fairly new discipline, as we all know. Until recently, there hasn't even been formal education around it. Everyone I know in product came in from a different field. So it's really important. These are the skills that we need, but no one ever teaches us and talks about it, right? And that's what I tried to tackle. You'll read a lot of embarrassing stories about me, stumbles, lessons I've learned, failures. And, there's even a bunch of great exercises on really challenging you and bringing out this right side of your brain to really think through how would you navigate product management from this perspective. So let's get into it. First main lesson I want to instill in the audience is put on a show. Listen, presentations and the way that we think of presentations are outdated, okay? You miss out on presentations. I think it's important to take your presentations as a product manager. Now, this could be a demo, this could be a roadshow, this could be a session with your stakeholders, but how do you build a story around it? For me, some of the important things that I like to think about is show and tell. People remember things when they see things, right? When they can see an experience, when they hear a story about an experience, or better yet, if someone is forced to use the experience, or if a client is there and shows a testimonial about an experience, right? These are the things that really bring it to life. So putting on a show is really what I gravitate towards now, as opposed to putting on just a presentation. I failed at this, right? We used to have in one of my roles a quarterly, it was a monthly, changed to a quarterly town hall, right? Where all 500 people in the company would come together and me and my team would present what we're working on, right? And our first town hall, it was a presentation. We had a bunch of stats, KPIs, metrics on how we succeeded in what we're building, right? And people started looking at their phones, right? Like 10 minutes in, I started reading their room and they zoned out. It wasn't exciting. And I don't blame them, because if I was on that side, I wouldn't find it exciting either, right? It was a bunch of data, a bunch of bullet points just being thrown at you. Now, think about the last time you went to a concert, or you watched a great movie, or you went to a great Broadway show, right? You didn't remember the guide that they gave you, right? You remembered the show that they put on. So what we vowed to ourselves on our failure that day is we're never going to do that again. We're going to put on a show that leaves lasting memories. Here's a real picture of someone on my team doing this, but we changed all of the time that we had on those monthly town halls into shows. You know who does a great job of this is actually Apple, right? Steve Jobs did a great job at this. Tim Cook does a great job at this. When they have their Apple broadcast, there's never presentations. It's people talking and showing the product, right? And they're giving you real life insight. And that's where our inspiration was. We started putting on these shows. We started showing mock-ups, black and whites, demos. We had role-playing exercises where someone acted as a customer and asked tough questions. Nobody looked at their phone, guys, because people were excited. And that was really what I call it, hashtag room reader, because that sticks with me. When I walk into any room now, I read the room and I make sure what I'm putting on as a show is resonating with people. Now, some tips for you. That's great that I went through it and failed, right? But how can you put on, change from a presentation into a show, right? As you start thinking this through. It doesn't happen overnight. I would say pick some areas that make sense and start thinking through how you would migrate into this new strategy. First and foremost, spark emotion, right? A bunch of bullets don't really spark emotion, right? I can read all the bullets on this slide to you directly, but that's not going to excite you. What sparks emotion is image, colors, stories, real life examples, right? Think about how you can engage your audience and bring them in to the party, right? And thinking through, and that's how great shows start. Get creative and interactive. Like, this is so important to me, but how do you get people involved, right? In the end of the day, a presentation, I tried to do this with exercises. It's a little bit harder on, streaming calls like this or Zoom calls. But when we get back into in-person, right, try to think about how you can make it bi-directional. How can you get people more engaged? How can you get them excited and brought involved into the story? So it doesn't feel like you're telling the story. It feels like we're collectively telling the story. And start with something eye-catching. In the end of the day, if you're working on a operational platform that's going to reduce efficiency by 80% and reduce costs by X million dollars, that's boring, right? But now what is exciting is, imagine your desk could get 15 hours back to start working on other cooler things that can help change the bottom line, right? As opposed to the first way I open the story, the second way gets me excited. Wow, my team can get some hours back to do something else, right? And it's not stuck in that jargon. So think about how you're going to really kind of use the right lingo and mannerism to get people involved. Second, and this one's so near and dear to me, and as you get better at this, you'll start to realize this is so important. All great stories have conflict. Right? The reason we watch amazing movies is because a good guy and a bad guy didn't get along, right? The reason we watch a fairy tale is because the princess had to struggle for some reason. We need to introduce that into our storytelling. What's broken? What's missing from the customer? Highlight what's missing in the market. What are we struggling, right? What is that issue? And don't be scared to bring it up, because that's actually going to get people engaged. What is that what is that turmoil, right? What is that thing that's really going to spark and bring people to say, wow, I'm excited. I want to learn how to do this. I had this issue as well. I remember I was sitting with our board for one of my roles, and we were going to get funding. We're going to get funding for working in a new way and getting funding for our new tech teams. And, this is a 100-plus-year company. They were doing things the way that they always did. And, they didn't really have to change. And if they went for another 5 years, nothing would have been drastically different. So they really came to me asking me, what is that? Why should we do it? Why should we invest $10 million in you to start thinking about new teams, right? And I gave them what I say, the not so subtle scare, right? If we don't change, somebody in a garage is working on something right now, and it could even be one of you on this call right now, that's just going to disrupt us. If we don't start disrupting ourselves, someone's going to come out and shake us and move us to the side. So don't get too comfortable. And I gave them real life examples. I gave them examples. This was a financial company. So I gave them examples of small disruptors that are doing this and doing that. And I'll tell you what, guys, they got nervous. They got nervous because they gave them that not so subtle scare. And I introduced conflict, and I introduced a struggle, and I made it uncomfortable, because making it uncomfortable helped remind them that we really need to start focusing on this. And, I'm happy to say we got the funding and it was great. But, I always relate back to the, to ageless, timeless Netflix blockbuster story. I'm sure most of you have heard it, but I told them, you don't want to be the next Blockbuster. Blockbuster is bankrupt. There's one left. And Netflix came to Blockbuster years ago and say, would you like to buy our streaming service for $50 million? The Blockbuster CEO laughed and said, that's never going to work, a streaming service. And look where we are now, right? Netflix is a multi-billion-dollar company. So if you don't disrupt if you stay too comfortable, you have to introduce these conflicts and these not so subtle scares and really kind of bring in your audience as you're telling your story. Some great tips on introducing conflict that I will just share with you guys here is highlight customer feedback. This is a really interesting one because we're so inclined to always, and I see it on tons and tons of websites, testimonials of the things that we do great, right? Sometimes it's good to bring in the negative feedback to say, try it. How would the negative feedback help your situation and help your story and help open people's eyes on why your product could help, right? Not so subtle scare, which we talked about. Show what is broken. Many times we spend our time talking and presenting, but it's also important to show your product, right? Like show what works and what doesn't work, or show a video of someone using it if you can't do it live. People really gravitate towards touchy-feely things, right? When they can see the conflict or see the issue on hand, it resonates much more than words. Fun stat, I think about, if we hear something versus if we actually see something, right? It's about 15x more resonates for us quicker, right? Just human nature, just our senses, the way they work. We tune people out quicker than we would if we see something, or if we see something especially that's conflicting. The last one is so, so critical, and I'll share a quick story on this one, is find the hero, but don't make yourself the hero, right? So many sites that I go to, they're like, we're going to solve this problem for you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Make the user the hero, right? Who does a really great job of this is REI. REI, if you don't know, is a sports equipment store, right? It's more of a high-end sports equipment store. If you go to the REI website today, right, they're going to share with you ideas that basically say, become a better camper, spend more time outdoors, right? Spend more time with your community. And then they position their products that way, right? But it's all about you. It brings you to the forefront and you as the hero. It says you should become a better camper. Here's the guide of things that I can offer to help you. You should become a better, outdoors man or woman. And here's the things I can do to help you, right? Now, Sports Authority on the flip side, which by the way is bankrupt, and I think there's only a few left, positioned everything as baseball, soccer, sports, right? They went right to their product and tried to be the savior, as opposed to REI, who's wildly successful, is putting you as the hero. And that's really important as you start introducing conflict and start thinking about who is the winner here, right? And it comes off much better in a story if you make the user the winner and not you. Keep it real. I hear this all the time, and geez, I'm going to share such an embarrassing story about myself on this is stories need to be genuine. We are very savvy as human beings, right? We can see when people are BSing us when they're selling us the truth, right? So be yourself, make sure your stories are authentic. I share a lot more on my book on this, but I even share that you should share embarrassing moments of yourself, right? Failures, trip ups that you had, iPhone, again, Apple does a great job of this. I was reading a paper on one. They actually show examples of the iPhone 1, iPhone 2, and they make fun of it, right? And they talk about how things weren't so great back then and look how they've evolved. So it's important to show your vulnerabilities, keep it real, show that you're genuine and show that you're real. Many times I've actually been coaching a lot of people that are product managers. They go right into trying to save everything, but they forget their authenticity, right? And it's important to kind of remain authentic and really kind of think that through as you tell your story. Fun story. I was working at a startup, and this is a great example of I had no idea and I didn't read the room, or nor did I actually spend time keeping it real. I'm not a suit guy. I drop suits. I wear blue jeans. I'm a jeans and sweatshirt type of guy. You can see I'm wearing that now. And I had a big meeting. It was like maybe my second week as like the chief product officer at a company. And they said, we're going to Salesforce in California. Salesforce, the big company right now. And we're going to close the deal and we're going to sell them our product. And I said, great. Right? Salesforce, here we come. I'm the new CPO. I'm going to tell the story. I got there, guys. I was the only one wearing a suit. Everybody was wearing sweatshirts and jeans. And, the guy pulled me over and he said, you seem like a great guy, but I'm not sure if you're a fit with our culture. We're really looking to work with a company that's a little bit more, innovative, right? And I was offended because I am innovative. And I'm like, no, I'm not the suit guy. I actually would dress like this, right? But I learned from that moment that I didn't do a good job of keeping it real. Now, a few tips I'll tell you that I've learned on this. If I go on an interview, if I go on a mentoring session, if I go into present at a company, I'll call the assistant, right? And I'll say, what's the culture like there? Do people wear suits? Do people wear jeans, right? Tell me more about the personalities, right? And usually the office assistants or the folks kind of administrationally setting it up, they know. And I actually proactively do that to make sure that I'm keeping it real and I'm bringing my authentic self, right? And that's a part of storytelling too, really kind of reading the environment and knowing your audience. So some tips here on how to keep it real. I mean, listen, as I said, snoop around a bit. You can go on LinkedIn if you don't feel like calling somebody. You can go and learn about, who they are, who their family is. Go on Facebook, see what their personal life is. I know it sounds creepy, but in the end of the day, you're going to come in more confident. You're going to say, oh, wow, they're actually a lot like me. They're not just an executive from a big company, right? And ask about the culture, ask about the team and the environment. So that's really important. And that's the lesson I learned from my failure there. Add real people's feedback, right? In the end of the day, gone are the days of people wanting that demo video of everything's great. Add the good and the bad and admit that your stuff isn't perfect. And here's some of the challenges, right? Sales 101, the best salespeople ever admit some of the flaws in their product too. Right? The worst sales folks actually talk all about the good stuff because we know what we can read between the lines. So it's important to kind of provide a lot of that real raw feedback. Get personal. I do this all the time. I share the story about my daughter. I share stories about my personal life. I share stories about when I failed. I share stories about when I failed as my product. I share embarrassing stories. I do it all the time. And I'm doing it here as a talk, but I would even do it if it was a product. At the time that I used the product, and I thought the website was horrible. And I'll say that, right? Because when people get personal and your stories get personal, you bring them in. You're not threatening anymore. And you're actually kind of showing vulnerability and making it more raw and real. And the last one, make fun of yourself and the product. I know it sounds funny, but again, Apple and some of the top companies do a great job at that. Final lesson here is, be flexible. There's a fine line here, right? Many times I've walked in and product managers, it just feels like when they're presenting, it's so scripted, right? It's like, this is what they're reading off a piece of paper. If they're not reading off a piece of paper, they're reading off a phone. If they're not reading off a phone, they're trying to remember what was written on their phone or their paper so they can say it verbatim, right? Don't do that. I like to, I might be outdating myself here. When I was in college, there was this thing called the Cliff Notes. Instead of reading the whole full novel or textbook, you can get the short version of it and get the highlights. Try to think of your talks or think of your presentations or your shows as the highlights, right? Because in the end of the day, if you try to remember everything and over practice, you're probably going to fail because you're going to come off as unauthentic. And second, sometimes life throws you a curveball. Right? I'll share a quick story with you. I was presenting to some top bankers when I was at Goldman about a new video conferencing solution in Chicago, right? So I flew to New York, from New York to Chicago with my team. It was the top bankers at Goldman, right? I had my deck ready. I had my demo website ready. I walked into the conference room. It was a 12 o'clock meeting. The bankers were 10 minutes late and they said, "Hey, man, instead of making this a meeting, you want to go grab pizza?" And I said, "What?" They're like, "Let's just make this a working lunch, and let's go grab some pizza," right? And I was very nervous because they threw a curveball at me. I had over prepared and practiced my script, and now I'm not going to have access to the slides. I'm not going to have access to the website to demo. And we're at a pizza shop drinking beers, right? What am I going to do? And, I started trying to fumble and started trying to tell my story and remember what slides they were and tried to do it like impromptu. And one of the bankers stops me and he's like, "This video conferencing stuff, can we try it?" And I said, "Okay." He said, "Use your phone, video conference one of your buddies on your team back in New York, and let's see what it looks like," right? And we did it. And it worked and they loved it and they signed up for the solution, right? None of what I had practiced actually came to fruition. I got thrown a curveball, but I remembered the highlights and I remembered how to do what I needed to do to get the job done. But that was such a great life lesson for me on how to improvise and be flexible. So how do you build this muscle of storytelling for the long haul, right? You have to kind of really imprint it into your brain and do it over and over. Don't over practice. Instead, think of your highlights. What are the top 5 things you want to get out of it? And what do you want to say? Because over practicing will just get you in trouble and you'll just come off authentic. Have a backup plan. As in my scenario, things are not going to always go the way you want it to go, right? If you have a backup plan and say, if everything fell apart, what can I quickly do? Michael or Michelle, be ready in New York because I might have to Skype you in or Zoom you in and we might have to improvise, right? And, this is a good lesson I learned. If you take anything from this presentation, every story should be summarized in 1 page and it's 4 quadrants. If you take a piece of paper and you put a line down the middle and you put a line vertically, you have 4 quadrants, 4 boxes. Every good story should be those 4 boxes. What I usually do is in my 4 quadrant story is the first one is the setup. Why are we here? What are we doing? The why. The second one is you. Who's the user? What's the struggles? The third is what are we solving? And maybe the fourth is the recommendations, right? And now that's my 4 quadrants. You can make yours be anything you want. But if you start practicing those 4 quadrants, you'll actually start realizing that your storytelling is becoming a part of your nature because a good story just really needs 4 quadrants. And the final point here is another good one. All great stories have forks in the road. A good story is never going to be a straight line. When I open it up to questions, someone's going to ask me something I didn't expect. So, sometimes a good story might go this way, right? Or a good story, presentation or show might go that way. You have to be flexible and be ready that, and roll with the punches because things might go in different ways and you have to be kind of prepared for that. Last few things I want to leave you with, and then we'll open up to questions. Something's very specific to product management here is I use this day in and day out, and I encourage you to. One, storytelling is such key as a PM to inspire your team. If you're in a product role, you probably have a designer, a tech team, QAs, maybe others behind you that are looking for you for inspiration. They want to know what are we doing next week's sprint, but what was also the long-term goal, right? So how do you kind of build some of these stories and, have that consistent and customer focused message. Once every week, I tell all of my product managers, it's usually on a Friday, we reserve about 30 minutes to tell our story, right? Everybody, all the PMs get together and they tell their story. It's not a slide, it's not a presentation. So for example, our mobile engineers would say, this is what we're doing on mobile, and this is what some feedback we got from real users. This is how excited they were. This is some of the things I'm planning. And they just tell their story, right? And everybody claps and everyone says, wow, and they ask questions. And that moment, it's not we're doing work, but that half an hour that we block out is really important because it brings and inspires the team and brings people together. So that's a quick one that you can use and take back to your desk. Second is convincing customers, right? Fun stat that I read somewhere is people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. People don't buy things because of the product only. They buy it because of you, right? So how are you convincing people to buy things, right? One of my mentors is actually probably the best storyteller I've ever met. She can sell anyone to anything, right? And it doesn't even have to be the best product, but she's really good at convincing and getting customers on board. So you really feel like you're in it with her, right? You're in it with her and you're actually buying her and her experience with the product. And that's where you should really think about how you can use storytelling to your advantage. The third one, Google does this quite a bit. A lot of Google PMs, one of my buddies works there, is they like product narratives. Before they even build or write any line of code, their PMs actually write what the story of the product would be, right? I want to build this mobile app, or let's just say, I want to build a search engine. It's going to do this. It's going to be simple. They take that story and they start selling it. They start communicating it with their internal engineers and audiences. So they actually start writing these books and chapters about their story and product before they even develop it. How counterintuitive is that, right? But the irony is that actually starts getting them in this mindset of people are on board because they already know the vision and they already know the story. So it sounds counterintuitive because we're always taught to first build, but they actually build the story arc first, and then they start getting and start advertising it, and then they start building. So interesting tactic, just see if that might be applied to what you do. A few useful tips, and this is whether you're in product or not, stories can be helpful in recognizing people. I do this all the time, whether it's your team, other people's team, even in your personal, right? Stories help build relationships, right? They really bring people together. My brother is actually a really good storyteller. He's not even in product or technology, but he does a great job of lifting people up and talking about other people's stories and sharing adventures of what he's done, right? And it's really important as you're going in your coffee chats or you're meeting one-on-ones, ask people, what's your story? What are you working on, right? Share some of your insights, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of that we talked about, and really help. Over time, these stories are going to help build and foster relationships. Change meetings. I talked about this in my last talk as well, but change meetings from formal meetings to storyboard sessions. It's so cheap, and I can't stress this enough. All you need is sticky notes and a whiteboard, but you can change any meeting into a storyboard session where you're brainstorming, and they're so much more collaborative and they're so much more effective than having the long, boring meetings that we're used to. Finally, make sure you have your own story. Okay. This is that 2-minute pitch. It could be about you. It could be about your product, but why do you exist? Why does your product exist? If someone was going to interview you, if you were going to give an intro, if you had 2 minutes to introduce yourself on a big call with investors, whatever it may be, right? What's the highlight reel, right? What's the highlight reel if you were a director of your career? I always have my story ready about my career because it helps me come up with stories about my product. I did want to share a quick few tips on your own story. I started with mine, and I'm happy to take this offline with everybody, but you should all have your own story. And if you want to email me yours and practice it, I'm happy to do that. But think of your story as a really quick book, right? The book has chapters. There's an early, the middle, and the finish, right? So what's the setup? What's the meat? And what's the finish? Give your highlights, right? Add humor and authenticity, sprinkle stats, but more importantly, why they matter. Whenever I tell my story, I'll tell my time at Northwestern Mutual, and I'll say that we went from 100,000 releases to over 100,000 users to over 2 million using it, right? But then I sprinkle in why. How did we do that? Because we changed the culture. Stats are great, but stats are more impactful if you put the reason and logic behind it. And show vulnerability, right? When you tell your 2-minute story, it's also important to kind of add in authenticity, show areas of it was hard. Listen, when I worked at Goldman Sachs, it was not easy. The culture is what you guys probably expect it was. It was hard. But one of my roles was to bring the business and technology side together. I just made that up, but that's a great example of introducing vulnerability on how you can bring that into some of your storytelling. Now back to the exercise. I'm going to quickly look at the comments, right? Based off everything we said, what would you do to make this story better? Becky needs a phone. She did some research, blah, blah, blah. She bought a phone, right? What made her choose the phone? What other devices did she discover? Those are things that adds to a story. Great, right? Some of the things that I would say, oh, would you add more details on her research? Okay, so on this point, I would add detail. Oh, but I like how you're saying and how it emotionally affected her. Great. Research is great, but more importantly is back up how did it emotionally affect her, right? Is there a problem, a conflict, right? Was all her friends suggesting her to look at an Android because that's better in their mind, right? And she was torn, right? How can we add some like juicy conflict into the story, right? So, there's no right answer here, but it's a very simple 3-line story, but you can even practice this at home. How do you take that story and how do you add some of the principles we talk about it to make it more meaty and fun and entertaining? Final thoughts, how can I help? I'm here for you guys. I right now spend a lot of time. This is not easy. All this stuff is really, really hard because this is not stuff that you'll find in a book, except in my book. But, these are these things that we don't talk about, right? And how do we kind of bring them to life? I'm here as a coach, mentor, advisor. I do talks and speaking engagements all the time. I host workshops. There's a lot of written and published pieces about what I've done, but I'm here more to just to listen, right? If you ever need my help in anything around this topic, I'm doing it with obviously with the league here, but I can do it with you as well. I'm here. Last thing I'd say, to build great products, you first need to build you, right? Product managers are so focused on building the best product. You need to stop and build a great you first. Then you can actually become from good to awesome as a product manager. That's all I have right now. I wanted to save most of the time for questions. To find me, VivekBedi.com. To email me, VivekBedi@gmail.com. Again, the book is You, the Product. And I hope you enjoyed the session.
I just love what you just finished your session with, like invest in yourself, build yourself as the product. And it's so true because, if you are not fully invested and enjoying your work as a product manager, the chances that you will make others to feel this way just go down. So thank you very much for that. Are you ready for some Q&A?
I'm ready.
Perfect. So the next question comes from Liron, and she's asking, how do you put a show in a structured situation like a job interview?
Yeah. Listen, I think that's hard. But in a job interview, this is what I do personally, and I've done in my career in the job interview. A job interview is very awkward, right? Because you're in a job interview, people are like wanting to ask you questions. They kind of really don't know what to ask. You're waiting for questions. I sometimes, and try this tactic. It might work for you, it might not, but I actually try to take control of the interview. What I mean by that is I start with, so excited to meet you, blah, 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 all the small talk, but I'd say, if it's helpful, I can give you my 2-minute story. I know resumes are great, but I can give you the quick highlights of my 2-minute story. Every single time I've been on an interview in 18 years, I'll tell you, no one's ever said, no, don't tell me the 2-minute story, right? And they'll say, yeah, of course, let's start there, because it makes them feel less awkward too, right? And then I'll say, so here's my story. I worked at Goldman, I did this, and I give them the highlights, and they're like, wow, cool. Now let me ask you something about that. Cool. Now let me ask you something about that. So it's really interesting, but if you take control of the interview and start off with almost saying, let me offer you my story, you've immediately shifted the paradigm where you're actually leading the interview, as funny as that sounds, right? And you're kind of taking it to the next step. So that's a way of putting on a show without actually putting on a show. Second part of this question, I think if someone gives you a use case or a structural thing that says, if you were an Uber PM, what would you do, right? Of course, I think there's importance. I personally, if I was asking that question, yeah, I don't know about the data of how you would create the next best app. But also I would love to say, and then I would do a lot of emotional studying, right? How did it make customers feel? Adding those bits in would make me feel like, wow, you're a PM that's thinking of the IQ and the EQ component and bringing it together. I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful. Perfect. Moving on to a question coming from Shelly, who's asking, the hardest part about starting a story or presentation is the beginning, actually starting it and putting the framework together. What are your tips and or tricks for how to start? How do you create a good framework?
Yeah, listen, I think in the end of the day, you should think about a framework if that's helpful for you, Shelley. But what I'd say is not all, this is actually kind of one of the catch-22s of storytelling, because every story is going to be different. Right? So you can't follow the same framework in every, instance. In this case, I'm telling you guys a webinar and it's a story, right? But if I was giving the same talk in a bunch of town hall setting live, I might have to adapt and change things around. So I think frameworks are definitely important, but more importantly, I'd like to just say, have a guide in your mind on how you do it. As far as starting the story, fun stat, you probably don't realize this, but if you go to a website within 10 seconds, you're either going to stay or leave, because the first thing you see, you either love it or leave it, and then you hit X, right? The same thing is with reality, right? Not on a website, you're probably going to stay because of the 30 seconds or a minute of what a person's saying. So bring your best foot forward in the beginning, right? Bring the energy, bring the passion. And what I'd say is usually start with something that's provocative. What I mean by that is I either start with a challenge, right? Or something that's broken. I love how even this talk was positioned in a way where, sometimes people would say, you might not be the best storyteller. You might not know that you're a great storyteller, right? So start to bring some of that in the beginning where it gets the person really excited to say, wow, I'm excited to learn more, right? So I like to bring the energy from the beginning. That's one tip. And also start lighthearted, right? In the end of the day, a lot of not so great storytellers, they actually start saying, great, we're here to talk about the financials. We're going to get into everything about the financials, right? You're already tuning me out. But if you said, guys, how's everybody doing? I'm here to talk about this new mobile app. Don't you have so many mobile apps on your phone and you usually delete most of them? Well, here's why I'm going to tell you mine is the one you're not going to delete. Right? That has nothing to do with my mobile app, but automatically I'm excited because I'm like, what is this guy talking about? And let me think it through a bit more. Hopefully that helps. I'm trying to give you the quick answer, but we can talk more about it offline if you want to reach out to me.
Guys, don't keep the goodies to the end. Open with them. This is good. The next one is from a 10, and she's asking, any tip on how to keep a story focused without giving too much information so that the listener is always involved?
Yeah. Pauses, breaths. I think that I'm victim of this, I'll tell you, even after so many years. But, this is something you have to practice. So now, out of all the things to practice, this is probably what you should practice is, how do I make sure I'm pausing and saying, how did that feel? Right? And ask questions that will spark more emotions, right? You don't pause for the hell of pausing, right? You basically say, guys, I know that was a lot. How does that make you feel? What does everyone think, right? I ask so look up open-ended questions. It's one of my favorites. It's in the book. If you ask open-ended questions, you're asking basically questions to get more comments back, right? And then you can spew more stuff and then you can get more back, right? So it's important to kind of, when you're doing some of this, like, is to take your time, take breaths and Spock. I'll talk about two techniques that I love. If you Google storytelling techniques, you're going to find a million, but I'll tell you the two that I love the most is zoom in and zoom out. So you can actually practice this a tin with a friend, right? And say, if you just tell them a basic story, even make up one. It doesn't even have to be about your product, like the Becky one I made up. You can say, tell me when to zoom in or zoom out. So Becky wanted to buy an iPhone. If I said zoom in, and I would say, that would force me to say, okay, she wanted to buy an iPhone because she's been on this old school phone that was on Saved by the Bell for so many years. Zoom out, okay? So you can practice some of these techniques to help do that. The other one is role-playing exercises. It's my favorite, where you pretend to be the customer and the customer pretends to be the product manager. Oh my God, life gets flipped, right? Because then you get to see from each other's perspective, and that's a good way where you can kind of listen as well as talk and think things through.
Lovely. Okay, next one is from Silman. It's a little long, so I'll cut through to the question. And he's asking, how should product managers communicate with people who are not product people? Specifically, we need to balance displaying confidence with not being super clear as to what the product is and not promising things.
Yeah. This was actually Salman a lot on my last talk as well, but I think that, when you're working with folks that aren't technical or on the product side, first of all, you need to keep things simple, right? Because in the end of the day, right, you might realize that you know what AWS cloud is and they might not, right? So it's important to kind of dissect and keep things simple and keep it in a language that they'll be able to understand. You can practice this. I'll tell you, I practice this with my wife. Whenever I'm doing a talk, my wife has nothing to do with product. She's on the business side. And I'll say, babe, if I read this to you, does that make sense? She's like, too geeky, do not know what you're saying. Or she'll say, that makes sense, right? So you can practice it with someone on your team. More importantly, you should practice it with someone not on your team. So there's two things I'll mention on this. One is I like to create an inner circle. In my career. The inner circle is a very small amount of people, maybe 2 to 3, that you trust, and they shouldn't be on your team. They should actually be people that are outside of your team, because your team either lies and says they love you, or your team either basically is going to, give you too harsh of a feedback or not see it. So this inner circle of folks, those are the folks that I'll say, can you grab a quick coffee? I got this big presentation with the CEO. Here's the highlight of what I'm thinking. What do you think? They'll say, that's too geeky, Vivek. I would change it to this. Or they'll say, that's not too much meat. Add this, right? So you should practice and bounce it off some people in your life. The second thing I'd say with, working with stakeholders is, it's important when things go wrong to also communicate with them, right? So to your point where you brought up, like, how do I overcommit but not overpromise? Listen, you have to be very clear, right? And I do a whole another talk on road mapping, but roadmap is a guide, not set in stone. So it's important to tell your stakeholders when you're telling your story is, here's the things we're working on and here's why, in English and simplicity. But things can go wrong. Life isn't perfect, right? And the minute something goes wrong, I'm going to be the first one to come tell you. Right? So tell them when things go wrong immediately, because it helps build that relationship and trust over time. I hope that answered it. If it didn't, happy to share more thoughts later.
These are great tips. And just to add one more thing to the reasons as for why not to do everything with your team when you want to test a story, just like think about user flow, right? So many times the flow is so obvious to us, and flow is another version of a story, right? But then when you just give either the phone or the computer to someone else, they don't know like the different steps that they need to take with you on this journey. So it's the same, when we're talking about story, when you go out of the mode of what you do at the office, this is when things get interesting. So this is good. Wonderful. We have some time for one more question. So I'll ask the guys to submit it in the comments. In the meantime, can I challenge you, Vivek?
Yes, I love challenges.
Good. If we were to choose one thing, just one thing that you would like all the product managers in our audience to focus on tomorrow, what it will be? And before you're answering that, I want to remind everyone that we love having you as the audience of us. So please make sure to like this video, like our channel, so you'll be notified about future events like this one. So, Vivek, one thing.
Yeah, I think there was a lot jam-packed in here, guys, and hopefully someone will send out the deck to you guys if you need it. But there was a lot of information. But if there's one thing I would say that's important is come up with your own story. Okay, forget your product management hat for a minute. Okay, what is if you were in, they always say that funny thing about the elevator pitch, but if you were stuck in the elevator with someone famous or President Obama or your CEO of your company, right? And they turned to you and said, "Hey, what's your story?" Right? And you're on floor 31 and the elevator's going to floor 1. What's the highlights of your career that you're going to tell somebody, right? And this might seem really like graphic, but I actually do this. I fast forward my life. And, if I passed away and at my funeral, what would they say about me? Right. And I try to say, would they say I'm a good dad? Would they say I'm a good husband? Would they say I was a good employee? Right. And those are the types of things that help you frame, like, what is your story? Just think through what your 2-minute story would look like. Once you've nailed that, everything else becomes a lot easier because you can use that as a framework or guide to help create your product story or your team story.
Loving it. So Janine in the audience, she's asking to know a little more about the 4 quadrants that you shared with
Yes.
us. Maybe I'll put the presentation on again.
I could
Oh, you
just
did.
share it really quick.
Perfect.
Yeah. I think the best way to do, I'm a firm believer of any story or presentation can actually be summarized in one page. Everything else is supporting information you need. So if you haven't done this, and you can probably try it out with your own story, right? Take a blank sheet of paper, vertical, right? And put a line in the middle, put a line through the middle on both sides. So you have 4 boxes, right? And those 4 boxes are really your story. So the first box at the top left is really the setup. So the setup is really the why. Why are you, let's just go with a simple example. If I'm building a new mobile app, right? Why are you building the mobile app? Why is it important? What is the need, right? Why is the market needed? So that's the whole why box, right? The second box is the what box. Here's clearly what we're building. We're building a mobile app on Apple. It's going to be user-friendly and blah, 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 right? The third box could then be, I generally don't get into how, because I think unless you're working with a tech audience, they don't really care about the how. They actually care about the why, the what, and the what's in it for me. Right? We're all selfish as people. So the third box I usually reserve is, this is what you're going to get for it, right? It's not just any other app. It's going to make you feel good. And here's the things you'll get out of it. And then the fourth box is I usually reserve it for a visual because I'm a very visual person. It could be a screenshot of the app or it could be anything, right? Now, that doesn't mean that your 4 boxes have to be my 4 boxes. It also doesn't mean that you use the same 4 boxes for every single product. The point here is if you slice it into those 4 boxes and start thinking through your story into those 4 areas, you'll start putting some bullets on each one. You'll actually start coming up with a narrative, right? And usually it's why, what's in it for me, and how recommendations or what it could look like, right? And that's a pretty damn good story. Everything else just gets kind of as like slides that get tucked up into those 4 boxes.
Perfect. I see that the audience is very excited about the motivation you gave them to share their own story
Yeah.
with people, and it lighted some spark. So there is another question coming from Sabrina, and she's asking, I would love to understand how to start my story in an interview with my hard skills, where I work currently, chronological or anti-chronological, with why I'm doing what I'm doing, my purpose, what's the best way. So I know you've already touched much of it before,
Yeah.
but I see from the comments that guys are so excited about it. So it may worth us to spend some more.
Yeah, I mean, listen, interviews are always difficult because it depends on who you're interviewing with, the company you're interviewing with. Generally, and I'll just give you my feedback, but feel free to improvise it. I would not start my story with hard skills, right? I think a good way to look at it is write down your 4 quadrants of your story and then repeat the story, or have someone else role play, have someone else say the story back to you, and would you say, would you want to hear that? Right? Like, I would not say, hey, I'm Scrum certified, I've been doing digital for 5 years, I know how to work an iOS app, sprint team. Like, I wouldn't do that, right? Because that's already, going back to my point, losing the audience. I would personally, I do like the chronological personally. I think that just like we were born as babies and we matured, I think I like that fact of, here's how I started, here's some of the things I went through, and here's where I am now. That's how I generally tell my story. And I try not to keep it only at hard skills, but I try to say, here's where I started, the middle, and here's where I am now. And I pick the 3 highlights of each of those times. So for example, in my story, I actually started as an engineer. Right. And that's actually what I went to school for. My education was engineering. I was a double major in comp sci and computer engineering, and I ended up in product. So I actually say that I started off as an engineer. I didn't even start in product. So I have very technical roots. Right. I was at Goldman for 18 years running the tech team. But then I moved over to digital products because I was always interested in the why. Already I've painted this beginning of the story, and they're like, wow. So he's a technical guy that was interested in the why and moved over at Goldman. That's already a great start. And I never even talked about any hard skills, right? So those are just some tips. And I'm happy to share with you guys my story over email to give you guys just like a guide or an indicator. But I like chronological. Don't start with hard skills. Make it fun and make it personal.
Wow, that's a great summary of what to do and how to do it. I had so much fun.
I had so much fun too. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was useful. And thank you for all the amazing questions as well.
So, Vivek, thank you so much. As always, such a great content. And guys, if you somehow missed Vivek first talk with us, make sure to watch it. You want to listen to it. I'll make sure to include a link to it in the comments. Thank you all for joining us. You know, it's so important to listen. It's so important to talk in a way that moves people. So I think this just gave us all such great motivation to do what we love, you know, being product managers in a way that keeps product and people moving. So this is so good. Thank you so much, Vivek, for joining us. Audience, it was great having you here with us. Please make sure to like this video. You can still comment on the video if you have questions, because Vivek will see it. Have an awesome, productive day, and I can't wait to see you all on our next session. Thank you, Vivek. Bye-bye.